We now must count Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain amongst the 123 Americans that commit suicide every day. We talk about the rising epidemic of suicide and possible causes, as well as a brief look at North Korea. I'm Vong, and this is A Civil Moment.
Get out! You bastard! You let me shoot 7%. Bird shot, you.
The people who did this Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were good people.
Hey, like this!
And it's a good place. Here we are in the middle of it, right up on the mountain. If this son of a bitch wants that bitch about his cows over here and shoot at me, well, it's our country. It's not theirs. It's not a bunch of used car dealers from Southern California. Democracy, you have to be a player.
That's Hunter S. Thompson speaking about democracy. While he's talking about democracy, he's actually engaged in a gun battle with presumably a neighbor of his. The neighbor's firing a shotgun full of birdshot at him, and Mr. Thompson is outside at dusk with a pair of shorts on, firing a Luger off into the air towards his neighbor, all the while clutching a cigarette in his hand. And while I don't condone getting into gunfights with your neighbors over their cows, there's certainly some truth to what Thompson has to say. In democracy, you have to be a player. In Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, Thompson penned this famous quote, "There he goes, one of God's own prototypes, a high-powered mutant of some kind never even considered for mass production. Too weird to live and too rare to die." Thompson committed suicide in February of 2005. He left this note: "No more games, no more bombs, no more walking, no more fun, no more swimming." 67. That is 17 years past 50. 17 more than I needed or wanted. Boring. I am always bitchy. No fun for anybody. 67. You're getting greedy. Act your old age. Relax. This won't hurt. And while Thompson himself was at the very least an odd duck, a high-powered mutant with a strange and bizarre outlook on life, drug-addled and a brilliant, troubled writer, when he killed himself, not too many people found it surprising, even if it was a tragic ending to a storied life. But this week, Kate Spade took her life. The famous designer was 55. She'd built a brand worth billions of dollars. She had a 13-year-old daughter and left her suicide note addressed to her. The note said, "This has nothing to do with you. Don't feel guilty. Ask your dad." And just a few days ago, Anthony Bourdain, 61, committed suicide as well, and left behind an 11-year-old daughter with whom he was extremely close. A couple years back, I was at a train station waiting for the train to see off my family. They were going to take the train to visit my in-laws who lived several states away. I remember the train was running late. As we walked back and forth, pacing and getting irritated and annoyed, one of the conductors walked up and said, "There's been a suicide, and that's why the train has been delayed." I asked him if it was a regular occurrence, and he said, around the holidays it always happens, and it takes a real toll on the engineers and the people who work on the trains. There's the unsavory aspect of what happens and the cleanup that's involved when someone commits suicide by train. I very clearly remember thinking that it was a selfish thing to do. And when we look at Kate Spade's child and we look at Anthony Bourdain's child, it is easy to believe that it was a selfish thing to do. David Foster Wallace, the American novelist, wrote this, quote, "The so-called psychotically depressed person who tries to kill herself doesn't do it out of, quote, hopelessness, or any abstract conviction that life's assets and debits do not square, and surely not because death seems suddenly appealing. The person in whom its invisible agony reaches a certain unendurable level will kill herself the same way a trapped person will eventually jump from the window of a burning high-rise. Make no mistake about the people who leap from burning windows. Their terror of falling from a great height is still just as great as it would be for you or me standing speculatively at the same window just checking out the view. The fear of falling remains a constant. The variable here is the other terror, the fire's flames. When the flames get close enough, falling to death becomes the slightly less terrible of two terrors. It's not desiring the fall, it's the terror of the flames, and yet nobody down on the sidewalk looking up and yelling "don't" and "hang on" can understand the jump. Not really. You'd have to have personally been trapped and felt flames to really understand a terror way beyond falling. Now, I don't know if that's how everybody who ends up committing or attempting suicide feels, but in Wallace's case, it's particularly poignant because he took his life after suffering with depression for the better part of 20 years. But what I do know is that on average, there are 123 suicides per day in the United States. And according to the CDC, the rate of suicide has increased by 25% since 1999. That coincides with a rise of 65% in the number of adults who are taking antidepressants. 1 in 8 American adults take antidepressants. And up to 21% of women and 12% of men will suffer from depression at some point in their lives. For the lucky majority who do not suffer from depression, who do not take antidepressants, it is perhaps very easy to consider suicide as a selfish act. However, along with the idea that individual liberty is important, the price that comes with placing so high a value on individual liberties and freedoms is the implicit understanding that perspectives not our own have inherent value, even if we fail to understand them. One only needs to know that both Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain cared deeply about their children and yet chose suicide anyway, to begin imagining what they must have felt, what must have drove them to the decision that they made. And certainly, we can both believe that they made the wrong decision and yet still believe that they felt they had no choice, and ultimately that we wish they could have received the help that they needed in the manner that they needed it. Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain are not the only victims of suicide. As I said, 123 Americans every day commit suicide, and roughly 22 of those are veterans. Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain, by virtue of their celebrity, are merely high-profile incidences of an underlying problem in our culture. And while there's some correlation between how much wealth you have and your propensity to suicide, at a certain point, having more money doesn't seem to insulate you. In the case of Kate Spade, she was a multimillionaire many times over, and likewise for Anthony Bourdain. There seems to be no single simple explanation, no single simple factor. There are many studies that cite a variety of possible complicating factors. There are studies that indicate that social media is a source of great discontent, that the news is constantly full of doom and gloom, and the steady diet of terrible news and political inadequacy or powerlessness drives people to a feeling of hopelessness. And certainly there are closer, more understandable reasons why people might contemplate suicide. Tragedy in the immediate circle of friends and family, or chronic illness or news of a difficult medical nature. But while some problems can be solved, certainly some problems are not solvable. Everybody this week, and I have in the past as well, given out the number to the National Suicide Lifeline. That number is 1-800-273-8255, and they are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But rather than just give out that number, if you have a phone, pick it up and call someone who you think might need help. Because there's no telling if Anthony Bourdain or Kate Spade would still be here. There's no telling if those 123 people a day who commit suicide would have changed their mind if someone had been there when they needed them. If it is because of difficult life circumstances, then for some people surviving them means having someone to help them survive. And for those who suffer from depression, it's no good and no help to tell them merely to feel better. And it isn't as simple as taking them out to lunch and talking with them, but it's a start, and it certainly doesn't hurt. Part of the responsibility in believing in personal liberty and personal responsibility is the understanding that some of that is grounded in a civic duty. And that duty does not necessarily mean serving the federal government, the state, or the county or the city. That can be as simple as being a good citizen to those around us in our day-to-day lives. Our lives are so full of distraction now. It is so easy to find something to kill an hour or a day, from movies to concerts to video games. You could literally burn your whole life away. And there's wisdom in the belief that time that you enjoyed spending is not time wasted. But the dose makes the poison. The things that bring spice and entertainment to our lives could very well rob us of all the possible meaning. What's interesting is meaning is different for everybody. But the one thing that seems to be constant, the one thing that seems to be important, is whatever meaning may mean to you, it typically requires that your life have an impact on someone else. Ultimately, people are social creatures, and we cannot survive on our own in the most literal sense of the word survive. That is to say that individual humans do very poorly in the wild, but also that we cannot survive on our own in a meaningful way without the interaction with other people. And we know this because in the 80s and 90s, under the communist rule of Nicolae Ceausescu, Romanian children were put into orphanages and raised without any real human contact. And what happened to them was eventually when they were rescued from these conditions, they were severely mentally handicapped. And parts of their brains, including the amygdala, were much smaller than normal human brains. And we know this because even though we often crave solitude, it is not something that is in the long term anything that would be desirable. Take, for example, in the worst of our prisons, even there the idea of being put into solitary confinement is a punishment beyond the maximum security environs in which these prisoners already find themselves. And one imagines that when you are suffering from severe depression that is untreated, that it must feel very solitary. And to imagine that someone suffers in this way for years or even decades might give some inkling into a perspective on why they would choose suicide as a way out. So rather than view what Kate Spade did as selfish because of her daughter, and rather than view what Anthony Bourdain did as selfish because of his daughter, we should consider that in these instances that there are both the victims who killed themselves and the victims that were left behind. We can do no more for the former, but perhaps there is something that we can do for the survivors. In this case, hopefully they have an adequate support system. The pain that they must be suffering is beyond simple measure. And among all the other possible reasons for the epidemic of suicide, there is perhaps a crisis of meaning in our culture. Part of that has to do with how we treat our children and ourselves. The rampant growth of things like participation trophy gets its usual ridicule, but if we dive into it, we can start to understand the real dangers and issues with that kind of thinking. Children aren't stupid. They see that we celebrate winning. We watch sports. We have elections. There is a very clearly defined winner and loser. And in the things that really matter, nobody is getting a participation trophy. Nobody gave Hillary Clinton a participation trophy for coming in second in the presidential elections. LeBron James and the Cleveland Cavaliers do not get a participation trophy for being swept out of the NBA Finals. There are two clear possible outcomes from the culture where we try to insulate our children from disappointment. One is they will come to believe that every bit of pseudo-effort or just showing up is good enough, and will suffer all kinds of psychological trauma when they are forced into a world where it matters how well you do something, not just whether you attempt it or not just whether you show up. The other outcome, perhaps, is even bleaker. It's where the children grow up and realize that they have been coddled all along and are not only ill-equipped to deal with this world, but they are constantly being told that they are good enough, while they understand that that is nothing to be proud of. Here's a character that Saturday Night Live had in the 90s, Stuart Smalley.
I deserve good things. I am entitled to my share of happiness. I refuse to beat myself up. I am an attractive person. I am fun to be with. And I'm going to help people because I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone it, people like me.
The crazy thing is that this is a caricature. It is a comedy skit about a character that is so ridiculous that people laughed at it. And yet this is the same kind of prescription we are giving to our youth and ourselves in this day and age. It's these daily affirmations about things that you can't control. It's the idea that self-esteem is the key. And it is. It is the key. Having good self-esteem is the key. But Stuart Smalley is looking into a mirror and telling himself how good he is. Well, here's the truth. If you have good self-esteem, the last thing you need to do is look into a mirror and tell yourself that you should have good self-esteem. And that's the problem. Saying that you are good is not the same as being good. Getting a trophy that says that you are good and should feel proud of yourself is not the same as having worked hard to be good at something. And yet really, self-esteem doesn't even require hard work at something. It merely requires you to be proud of what it is that you have done. And there's the key. You have to have done something. It does not require arduous labor. It does not require a lifetime of artistry, though certainly the people who spend their lives perfecting whatever art or skill it is that they find meaningful will never complain about the lack of meaning they have in their lives. And that's not to say that meaning is the cure to depression. It might not be for everyone. But certainly the lack of meaning is a contributing factor to a lot of people who feel aimless in their lives. And part of it has to do with the idea that what is under their control has been taken away from them. People are being told to be proud of what they are instead of what they have done. And it is a substantial and really important substantive difference. Part of the first scenario I talked about earlier, where children who live in a society where they are given participation trophies have gone on to the real world and found themselves woefully unprepared for it after an entire lifetime of being affirmed for what they are as opposed to what they have done, is that there's this weird shift to try to bring that childhood all the way along. There are universities where people are supposed to be going to be challenged in their ideas so that they could refine their thinking. Again, nobody sharpens their knife on a rubber block. You need something harder than the knife. Your ideas must be tested in order that you know whether or not they are good ideas or whether they need modifying. And that goes for anybody, whether they're in college or not. But you have these college campuses where people are coming to speak with challenging ideas, and the children who are 20-some years old going to these colleges are being put into safe rooms and given coloring books and crayons so that they can feel safe. After President Trump's election, the University of Pennsylvania created a safe space complete with coloring books and puppies and a cat on hand to provide therapeutic cuddling for shell-shocked students. Administrators had also printed out sheets of paper from a coloring book, and these pages contained positive messages for students to color. Imagine then these students coming out into the real world and finding that sometimes you lose. Sometimes your ideas are overruled by a larger majority of people. Well, how would you deal with that? Communally, you go on social media and you find an echo chamber where you can feel affirmed, but what happens when that wears off? It's no surprise that people in this environment might find themselves lacking meaning in their lives. And the outgrowth that nobody's feelings should be hurt, that everybody should be immune to outrage or offense, is that people's actions now are secondary to what they are. Because if you are allowed to be overwhelmingly proud of whatever it is that you are, and held less to account about whatever it is that you do, after all, the act of doing, especially when others are doing the same thing, is that you might be faced with the scenario where you might have to determine that someone is better at something than another, whether it be because of skill and hard work or just raw talent. But if you take away the things that you do and hold to account or hold in greater value the things you are, that is the birth of identity politics. That is the birth of something that is of no good to anybody. Because while you may be a woman or a man or black or white or Asian or Mexican, those things, if they are of primary importance, if you are proud of that rather than how you have contributed to whatever heritage it is that you have every right to feel fortunate for being, when you bring into conflict ideas, how can you resolve a white and a black person if what is the conflict is that they are white and black instead of what the white person has done, that individual white person, or what that black person has done, that individual black person? Where is the middle ground if the difference is something that cannot be controlled? But that is the allure, because in order to be a member of that tribe, you have had need do nothing. You merely are that, and therefore you are accepted, as long as you adhere to the orthodoxy. Nothing will get you kicked out of being black faster than being Kanye West and putting on a MAGA hat and praising Donald Trump, for instance. According to Hillary Clinton, nothing gets you kicked out of being a woman faster than having the audacity to have not voted for her, unless, of course, your overbearing husband or some other male in your life forced you to do just that. And as I said, there's nothing wrong with feeling fortunate that you are where you are. There's nothing wrong with feeling fortunate that you are in whatever circumstance you are, but that is a starting point. What you should be proud of is using whatever gifts and whatever starting point you are at in order to do something meaningful. You should be proud of your acts, whatever they are, whatever small step they happen to be. You ever go to the gym and there's a heavily overweight person on the treadmill? They had to start somewhere, and that deserves something. Walking through those doors is not an easy task. Walking through the doors the first time is not an easy task. Walking through the doors the second time is not an easy task. And especially walking through the door the 30th time is no easy task either. And even so, finding meaning may not be enough. Anthony Bourdain championed a lot of charitable causes, no doubt to find some meaning in his life. And ultimately, it was not enough. But even if it's not the cure, even if it's not the thing that keeps depression at bay, there certainly is a lack of meaning for a lot of people, and that certainly does lead to depression or a feeling of aimlessness for a lot of people. and we can find distraction at any time for however long we want. And it is so easy to be a slacktivist. You know, you see those posts on Facebook. Share this so that everyone is aware of this horrendous tragedy, so that everybody can share it, so that everybody is aware of it. Well, that's all well and good. But the actual gift of time and effort should go farther than that, and it does not require a lifetime of dedication, and it does not require that you do some great grandiose act for the nation or for your state or your city or your county, though certainly those things are open to you. And it doesn't even require that you do some act for a stranger, because we all have within our circle of friends and family that we don't see as often as we would like the ability to improve somebody's life in even some small way, whether it is the gift of time or conversation or a shared meal. Because even if you do not suffer from depression, even if this does not stave off the depression that you do suffer, there is every opportunity and every possibility that you are helping someone else more than you know. All right, on to other news. As we speak, President Trump and Kim Jong-un are meeting in Singapore for a summit. Everybody's going on and on about analyzing whatever video or images are coming out of these first few moments of the summit, going so far as to analyze the 13-second handshake that Trump had with Kim Jong-un and whether or not the patting of Kim Jong-un's shoulder by Donald Trump was a sign of assertive dominance or whatever. It'll be interesting to see if anything comes out of this summit. Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, has said that we will make unique guarantees to North Korea in a bid to have them denuclearize. It's quite possible that they are in no condition, as I've stated previously, to continue any nuclear testing because they blew up their test site. And there are also reports that human rights are off the table for discussions with North Korea, which means that the plight of the millions enslaved and imprisoned in the gulags of the North Korean state will likely remain there for at least the immediate foreseeable future. That didn't stop Dennis Rodman from putting on a MAGA hat and appearing on television crying with tears of joy over the Trump and Kim summit.
When I went back home, I got so many death threats. I was sitting there protecting everything. And I believed in North Korea. And when I went home, I couldn't even go home. I had to hide out for 30 days. I couldn't even go home. But I kept my head up high, brother. I knew things were going to change. I knew it. I was the only one. I never had no one to hear me. I didn't know one had to see me. But I took those bullets. I took all that. I took everything. Everyone came at me, and I'm still standing. And today is a great day for everybody. Singapore, Tokyo, China, everything. It's a great day.
It's Dennis Rodman talking about the death threats he received after he returned home from some of his trips to North Korea. And you have to feel for him. I mean, whether or not it was misguided, whether or not his relationship with Kim Jong-un is self-serving either for himself or for Kim, and whether or not Dennis Rodman's belief that Kim Jong-un wants to forward his country is turning a blind eye towards the millions in that country who currently suffer for political reasons. And we're talking about forced labor camps and death by starvation in those labor camps. Whether or not those things are true, certainly Dennis Rodman is not deserving of death threats. And certainly the whole world hopes that Dennis Rodman, against all odds, is correct, that he has it right, that this meeting will result in some great outcome for the security of the world, the North Korean people, as well as the American public. It still seems rather unlikely, at least in this early phase, that all those things will come to pass. But in this instance, I would dearly, dearly love to be wrong. And in lighter, more uplifting news, a special education teacher in New Jersey by the name of Genevieve Viacava promise one day to donate $1 million to her students. She died in 2011 and had amassed a small fortune by living frugally her whole life. So starting with the 2019 and 2020 school year, one special ed student seeking post-high school education, such as college or trade school, will be eligible to receive a $25,000 scholarship thanks to Mrs. Viacava's gift. Because of the way that the gift is structured and because the size of the scholarships, Mrs. Viacava's scholarship will continue on in perpetuity because of the interest that will accrue over time. In order to save that money, she apparently did not buy the hearing aids that she needed. She seemed to have very little in the way of new clothes and stopped going on vacations after her husband died. That is really an incredible thing, and while few of us will be in a position to do what Mrs. Viacava has done, there's no doubt that we can all draw a lot of inspiration from it, and we can all be grateful for people like Genevieve Viacava. If you've enjoyed this program or found it informative or enlightening, please subscribe. The Civil Moment podcast is new, and your support and involvement is greatly appreciated and absolutely vital if we are to continue doing this. Listen to our podcast on iTunes or SoundCloud and leave a review. Our audio is now also available on YouTube. Follow us on social media at Facebook or Twitter. Like and share our podcast announcement. It all helps. You can contact us by sending an email to podcast@civilmoment.com or visiting us on our website at www.civilmoment.com. Thank you. Until next time, I'm Vong, and this has been A Civil Moment. This podcast, copyright 2018, Phase Final Incorporated.